let's stick on the N1 implant itself. So the thing that's in the brain. So I'm looking at a picture of it. There's an enclosure. There's a charging coil. So we didn't talk about the charging, which is fascinating. The battery, the power electronics, the antenna. Then there's the signal processing electronics. I wonder if there's more kinds of signal processing you can do. That's another question. And then there's the threads themselves with the enclosure on the bottom. So maybe to ask about the charging. So there's a external charging device.
Yeah, there's an external charging device. So yeah, the second part of the implant, the threads are the ones, again, just the last 3 to 5 millimeters are the ones that are actually penetrating the cortex. Yeah. Rest of it is, actually most of the volume is occupied by the battery, rechargeable battery. And it's about the size of a quarter. I actually have a device here if you want to take a look at it. This is the flexible thread component of it, and then this is the implant. So it's about the size of a US quarter. It's about 9 millimeter thick. So basically, this implant, once you have the craniectomy and the thoracotomy, threads are inserted, and the hole that you created, this craniectomy, gets replaced with that. So basically, that thing plugs that hole, and you can screw in these self-drilling cranial screws to hold it in place. And at the end of the day, once you have the skin flap over, there's only about 2 to 3 millimeters that's, obviously transitioning off of the top of the implant to where the screws are. And that's the minor bump that you have.
Those threads look tiny. That's incredible. That is really incredible. And also, as you're right, most of the actual volume is the battery.
Yeah.
Wow, this is way smaller than I realized.
They are also, the threads themselves are quite strong.
They look strong.
And the thread themselves also has a very interesting feature at the end of it called the loop. And that's the mechanism to which the robot is able to interface and manipulate this tiny hair-like structure.
And they're tiny. So what's the width of a thread?
Yeah, so the width of a thread starts from 16 micron and then tapers out to about 84 micron. So, average human hair is about 80 to 100 micron in width.
This thing is amazing.
Yeah, so most of the volume is occupied by the battery, rechargeable lithium-ion cell. And the charging is done through inductive charging, which is actually very commonly used. Your cell phone, most cell phones have that. The biggest difference is that, for us, usually when you have a phone and you want to charge it on a charging pad, you don't really care how hot it gets. Whereas for us, it matters. There's a very strict regulation and good reasons to not actually increase the surrounding tissue temperature by 2 degrees Celsius. So there's actually a lot of innovation that is packed into this to allow charging of this implant without causing that temperature threshold to reach. And even small things like you see this charging coil and what's called a ferrite shield, right? So without that ferrite shield, what you end up having when you have resonant inductive charging is that the battery itself is a metallic can, and you form these eddy currents from external charger, and that causes heating, and that actually contributes to inefficiency in charging. So this ferrite shield, what it does is that it actually concentrate that field line away from the battery and then around the coil that's actually wrapped around it.
There's a lot of really fascinating design here to make it. I mean, you're integrating a computer into a complex biological system.
Yeah, there's a lot of innovation here. I would say that part of what enabled this was just the innovations in the wearable. There's a lot of really, really powerful, tiny, low power microcontrollers, temperature sensors, or various different sensors, and power electronics. A lot of innovation really came in the charging coil design, how this is packaged, and how do you enable charging such that you don't really exceed that temperature limit, which is not a constraint for other devices out there.
So let's talk about the threads themselves, those tiny, tiny, tiny things. So how many of them are there? You mentioned 1,000 electrodes. How many threads are there? And what do the electrodes have to do with the threads?
Yeah, so the current instantiation of the device has 64 threads, and each thread has 16 electrodes for a total of 1,024 electrodes that are capable of both recording and stimulating. And the thread is basically this polymer insulated wire. The metal conductor is the kind of a tiramisu cake of gold plat tie. And they're very, very tiny wires, 2 micron in width, so 2/1 millionth of meter.
It's crazy that thing I'm looking at has the polymer insulation, has the conducting material, and has 16 electrodes at the end of it.
On each of those threads.
Yeah, on each of those threads.
Correct.
16. Each one of those.
Yes, you're not going to be able to see it with naked eyes.
And I mean, to state the obvious, or maybe for people who are just listening, they're flexible.
Yes. That's also one element that was incredibly important for us. So each of these threads are, as I mentioned, 16 micron in width, and then they taper to 84 micron, but in thickness, they're less than 5 micron. Mm-hmm. And in thickness is mostly, a polyimide at the bottom and this metal track, and then another polyimide. So 2 micron of polyimide, 400 nanometer of this metal stack, and 2 micron of polyimide sandwiched together to protect it from the environment that is 37 degrees C bag of salt water.
So what's some, maybe can you speak to some interesting aspects of the material design here? Like, what does it take to design a thing like this and to be able to manufacture a thing like this for people who don't know anything about this kind of thing?
Yeah, so the material selection that we have is not, I don't think it was particularly unique. There were other labs, and there are other labs that are kind of looking at similar material stack. There's kind of a fundamental question, and still needs to be answered around the longevity and reliability of these microelectrodes that we call, compared to some of the other more conventional neural interfaces devices that are intracranial, so penetrating the cortex, that are more rigid, like the Utah array, that are these 4x4 millimeter kind of silicon shank that have exposed recording site at the end of it. That's been kind of the innovation from Richard Norman back in 1997. It's called the Utah array because he was at University of Utah.
And what does the Utah array look like? So it's a rigid type of
so we can actually look it up. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a bed of needle. There's
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Those are rigid shank.
Rigid. Yeah, you weren't kidding.
And the size and the number of shanks vary anywhere from 64 to 128. At the very tip of it is an exposed electrode that actually records neural signal. The other thing that's interesting to note is that unlike Neuralink threads that have recording electrodes that are actually exposed iridium oxide recording sites along the depth, this is only at a single depth. So these Utah array spokes can be anywhere between 0.5 millimeters to 1.5 millimeter. And they also have designs that are slanted, so you can have it inserted at different depth. But that's one of the other big differences. And then, the main key difference is the fact that there's no active electronics. These are just electrodes. And then there's a bundle of a wire that you're seeing. And then that actually then exits the craniectomy, that then has this port that you can connect to for any external electronic devices. They are working on or have the wireless telemetry device, but it still requires a through the skin port that actually is one of the biggest failure modes for infection for the system.
What are some of the challenges associated with flexible threads? Like, for example, on the robotics side, R1, implanting those threads. How difficult is that task?
So as you mentioned, they're very, very difficult to maneuver by hand. These youth arrays that you saw earlier, they're actually inserted by a neurosurgeon actually positioning it near the site that they want, and then they're actually there's a pneumatic hammer that actually pushes them in. So it's a pretty simple process, and they're easy to maneuver. But for these thin film arrays, they're very, very tiny and flexible, so they're very difficult to maneuver. So that's why we built an entire robot to do that. There are other reasons for why we built the robot, and that is ultimately we want this to help millions and millions of people that can benefit from this, and there just aren't that many neurosurgeons out there. Robots can be something that we hope can actually do large parts of the surgery. But the robot is this entire other sort of category of product that we're working on, and it's essentially this multi-axis gantry system that has the specialized robot head that has all of the optics and this kind of a needle retracting mechanism that maneuvers these threads via this loop structure that you have on the thread.
So the thread already has a loop structure by which you can grab it.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So this is fascinating. So you mentioned optics. So there's a robot, R1. So for now, there's a human that actually creates a hole in the skull. And then after that, there's a computer vision component that's finding a way to avoid the blood vessels. And then you're grabbing it by the loop, each individual thread, and placing it in a particular location to avoid the blood vessels. And also choosing the depth of placement, all that.
Correct.
Kind of stuff. So controlling the 3D geometry of the placement.
Correct. So the aspect of this robot that is unique is that it's not surgeon assisted or human assisted. It's a semi-automatic or automatic robot. Once obviously there are human component to it when you're placing targets. You can always move it away from kind of major vessels that you see. But I mean, we want to get to a point where one click and it just does the surgery within minutes.
So the computer vision component finds great targets, candidates, and the human kind of approves them. And the robot does it do like one thread at a time, or does it do?
It does one thread at a time, and that's actually also one thing that we are looking at ways to do multiple threads at a time. There's nothing stopping from it. You can have multiple kind of engagement mechanisms, but right now it's one by one, and we also still do quite a bit of just kind of verification to make sure that it got inserted. If so, how deep? Did it actually match what was programmed in, and so on and so forth. And
the actual electrodes are placed at differing depths in the it's very small differences, but differences.
Yeah.
And so that there's some reasoning behind that, as you mentioned, like it gets more varied signal.
Yeah, we try to place them all around 3 or 4 millimeter from the surface, just because the span of the electrode, those 16 electrodes that we currently have in this version, spans roughly around 3 millimeters. So we want to get all of those in the brain.
This is fascinating. Okay, so there's a million questions here. If we go zoom in specifically on the electrodes, so what is your sense? How many neurons is each individual electrode listening to?
Yeah, each electrode can record from anywhere between 0 to 40, as I mentioned, right, earlier. But practically speaking, we only see about, at most, like 2 to 3. And you can actually distinguish which neuron it's coming from by the shape of the spikes.
Oh, cool.
So I mentioned the spike detection algorithm that we have. It's called BOSS algorithm, Buffer Online Spike Sorter.
Nice.
It actually outputs, at the end of the day, 6 unique values, which are, kind of the amplitude of these like negative going hump, middle hump, like positive going hump, and then also the time at which these happen. And from that, you can have kind of a statistical probability estimation of, is that a spike? Is it not a spike? And then based on that, you could also determine, oh, that spike looks different than that spike, must come from a different neuron.
Okay, so that's a nice signal processing step from which you can then make much better predictions about if there's a spike, especially in this kind of context where there could be multiple neurons screaming. And that also results in you being able to compress the data better. In the end of the day. Okay. That's
and just to be clear, I mean, the labs do this, what's called spike sorting. Usually once you have these like broadband, like the fully digitized signals, and then you run a bunch of different set of algorithms to kind of tease apart. It's just all of this for us is done on the device.
On the device.
In a very low power, custom, built ASIC digital processing unit.
Highly heat constrained.
And the processing time from signal going in and giving you the output is less than a microsecond, which is a very, very short amount of time.
Oh yeah, so the latency has to be super short.
Correct.
Oh wow. Oh, that's a pain in the ass.
Yeah, latency is this huge thing that you have to deal with. Right now, the biggest source of latency comes from the Bluetooth. The way in which they're packetized, and we bin them in 15 millisecond.
Oh, interesting. So it's communication constraint. Is there some potential innovation there on the protocol used?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, Bluetooth is definitely not our final wireless communication protocol that we want to get to. It's a highly
hence the N1 and the R1. I imagine that increases.
NX, RX.
Yeah, that's the communication protocol, because Bluetooth allows you to communicate against farther distances than you need to, so you can go much shorter.
Yeah, the primary motivation for choosing Bluetooth is that, I mean, everything has Bluetooth.
All right, so you can talk to any device.
Interoperability is just absolutely essential, especially in this early phase. And in many ways, if you can access a phone or a computer, you can do anything.